Ryan McMillan. I'm here to talk about Indian residential schools. I'm presenting some of my National History Day competition project research. My project is titled Indian Residential Schools Assimilation and Genocide by me, Riley McMillan. Last summer, news around the world exploded when Canada saw an alarming number of children's remains uncovered from former residential Indian residential school sites. By midsummer, over 1,500 remains at 7 sites were found, and in Canada and the US, almost 500 more school sites to go to. I wanted to see if the USA had a similar problem, so I chose this topic to research for my National History Day. Some background of these schools. The US was coming off of about 40 plus years of extensive Indian wars, with over 40,000 deaths and millions of dollars spent. Westward expansion was in full swing, and land was getting scarce for white settlers. So, it was considered cheaper to assimilate rather than just exterminate every Native American. Starting in 1819, education became the main policy to achieve assimilation. Many schools were created with an emphasis on making Indian children into tanned white Americans. Instead of just pushing Native Americans west, once they ran out of land, assimilation was considered a kinder and gentler approach. This is a photo of Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, the first Indian residential boarding school. People. The history of Indian residential schools. Started by Colonel Richard Carlisle, they were modeled after a military prison. The first one opened in 1879, which was Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, and after that quickly opened after. Canada sent a bunch of people to Carlisle to learn how to operate their own residential schools. Haskell and Lawrence was the closest one to us, and they are now repurposed it into a college. So I think that's cool. Both extermination and cultural genocide approaches were considered for the solution to the Indian problem. And cultural genocide through these schools was chosen as the most economical and cost effective approach. So they basically chose it because it was cheaper for them. This map shows the locations of some residential schools by 1892. Note the only one in the east, which is number 25. That's Carlisle. Haskell and Lawrence, which is the number 18 one, was one of the first opened, and it was opened in 1884. Yeah. Haskell quickly became one of the biggest Indian residential schools in the country during the boarding school period. This is a photo of Haskell. Attendance was first required by treaties, but not well enforced. Further rules were introduced, giving the power to Indian agents to coerce attendance by punishing families who didn't send their kids to schools through withholding their treaty payments. Note, this rule only required attendance at a school, not boarding schools specifically. Families were lied to by recruiters who would come to their reservations to get them to send their children to these schools. There was no accountability for the lies, and these tactics were even described in the Indian School Superintendent annual reports. If tricking them didn't work, force was also used. Of course. Military and police often used to drag unwilling children away from their traumatized families. Reports at the time recommended that only older children who had already attended some schools be the one who to attend these schools. But in reality, these children as young as 4 were placed in these schools and who did not have the ability to take care of them. Here's what a typical day might look like. If you can see it properly, you can see how tightly packed their days are from 6 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. with no real free time. The entire point of these schools was to educate the Native Americans away from their cultures and replace it with American values. In a nutshell, assimilation. The stated goal was to kill the Indian and save the man. Their culture was immediately attacked on arrival, as their hair was cut, clothes was taken away, and their languages were forbidden. This is a sleeping dorm in Haskell's dorm, and it's a sleeping porch. This used to house students in overcrowded conditions. These had no insulation. This is Kansas. Can you imagine how cold this was in winter and hot this was in summer? The mandatory attendance rules resulted in a big increase in the number of students going to these schools, leading to overcrowding. The first half of each day was in school doing academic subjects, while the afternoons were spent and evenings were spent on skill training. Here's a photo of one of the schools. The quality of education was often poor, and was underpaid and often unqualified. Many children had no exposure to school before being sent to these schools, so academic subjects were taught at a very, very basic level. To make sure these schools didn't cost much, the work the children did often financially supported the schools, and they even had to farm to grow most of their eaten food there. On top of this, there was the outing system, developed where Indian children were placed as laborers in the community to learn skills rather than step foot in a classroom. Education was not used to fully integrate Native Americans into society, but basically was designed to turn them into manual laborers. The Merriam Report in the late 1920s slammed the physical labor. these children had to do, calling it illegal child labor. Even the skills these children were taught quickly quickly became out of date. This meant no good jobs were waiting for these children when they left school. This is a picture of children's handcuffs in Haskell's collection. These were used as punishment for runaways and children forced into confinement. I'll let you look at those real quick. Remember, this was modeled after the military, so punishments were often harsh and culturally inappropriate because Native American parenting did not include physical correction, so this added to the trauma of these children. These children had no one to protect them, they were subjected to sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. Sickness and death were common, and medical care was not good, and overcrowding allowed disease to spread easily. Many children were malnourished, which made them weak as well. These children were often buried at school and not returned to their families. Many are in unmarked graves that are just starting to be discovered. We still don't know how many children attended these schools in the US, let alone how many died in these schools. Fun fact, they even had to build their classmates' coffins. Yeah. Living conditions contributed to the spread of these diseases. Records of how many children attended these schools in the US are suspiciously thin. This is just starting to be looked at by the federal government with a report hopefully due this summer. What was the point of this assimilation? Land. The Native Americans had land in reservations that started to look attractive. The Dawes Act was enacted to split up reservations and sell off land, rewarding people who went to these boarding schools and selling the land to white settlers. To add insult to injury, the money collected from these forced sales then went to the residential school systems and the trauma it created. There are many short term and long term consequences of these schools. Inter- and inter- Intergenerational trauma that harm Native communities is one of them. Some short term impacts was it destroyed families, many died, traumatized kids, and many suffered serious abuse. Some long this led One of the long-term impacts was this led to high rates of addiction, violence, abuse, and illness. It also changed the traditional role of women in Native society to mirror the that of white women in Victorian society. And also, they lost millions of acres of land. This resulted in messed up kids who grew up without parents, and then they grew up to have kids, but they had no clue how to parent. And it just kept going for generations. Generations. And I got an interview with Chief Charles Sampson, a Wapol Island First Nation, and I got this on August 12th, 2021. There's even a subtype of post traumatic stress disorder for Indian residential school survivors. One of the very few pluses, it helped bring together tribal differences between these children, which contributed to the Pan Indian movement for more civil rights in the 1960s and the 1970s. Just like it's hard to say good things about concentration camps, it's hard to say good things about these residential schools. If you look at the definition of genocide, which I have here, you will see that several points apply to in this situation, meaning these schools were a tool for genocide and the children were cannon fodders in the war for assimilation. Thank you.